5, 4, 3, roll deck 5, track.
Good evening. I'm Richard French, and this is The Big Story. America was founded on the principle of equality for everyone, including a solid educational foundation for every child. Bilingual education programs were established in the 1960s to make sure that immigrants did not get left behind academically. But studies now are coming out that show that these bilingual classes are not as successful as once thought. Tonight, we want to know if you think the bilingual education system is detrimental to the learning progress of non-native speakers, or do you think a slower immersion into the English language is a better way for children to assimilate into the American culture? We want to welcome our guest to the program here tonight in just a second, but first, let's take a look at the history of this very controversial education system in our country. And between 1920 and 1960, there was English immersion, and is popularly called the sink or swim policy. Changed in 1968. In 68, Bilingual Education Act recognized the educational disadvantage that were faced by non-English speaking students. And in 1963, going back a little bit, success of bilingual program for Cuban refugees in Florida inspired similar programs. Fast forward here a little bit, in '74, Congress passed the Equal Educational Opportunity Act, ruling that identical education does not constitute equal education. What this really meant, quite simply, was, you know what, just because it's equal education, you've got to provide here different languages, and you have to give these kids the equal chances. In '67, Governor Ronald Reagan here, remember, obviously Republican governor, he signed the bill eliminating English-only instructional mandate. And in '98, under Proposition 227, moving forward, 1.4 million students are mainstreamed into classes after 1 year of English instruction. Interesting to note here, Republican governor in California at the time, this was very popular in the '60s here. This was something that would basically equal out the playing field. And if you also know, we are now in the age where we're reanalyzing a lot of these beliefs. Welfare was reformed here. Most people look back and say it was a success. Now the issue of bilingual education. Should it be left as it is, or should we change it? California, we're going to be talking about successes and or failures of ending the bilingual educational system, and get to your phone calls in just a second. I want to now welcome our guest, and we are now joined by the co-author of Proposition 227 and the chairman of English for Children, Ron Unz, who you saw in that piece earlier. In addition to Mr. Unz, we're also joined by the director of the Education and Child Welfare Program for the Reason Public Policy Institute, Lisa Snell, who joins us on the phone line. Thank you, both of you, for joining me this evening.
Great to be here.
It's an interesting debate, and I guess as we're sitting here in 2000, if we went back in '96, '97 to have this debate, I guess, Mr. Unz, you would have been labeled as pretty arch-conservative here without the consideration of the children in mind. Now that you see some of the results that have come out of California, do you feel vindicated in any way?
Well, yeah, I think I feel vindicated, and I think the vast majority of Californians who voted for the measure also feel vindicated. I really think there never was much support for native language instruction among any groups in the broad public, and it was kept in place simply because a very small number of people worked in the bilingual education industry and wanted to keep the program going.
Lisa, let me ask you, were you surprised by some of the results, and these were taken by nonpartisan groups here, as to how these children have performed in the last couple of years out of California since it was basically put in a sink or swim policy after a year of transition?
No, not surprised at all. In fact, smaller pilot programs indicate that when children are immersed in English only, that their test scores tend to go up. So there were even before Proposition 227, there were obviously other research that indicated that that program worked well for immigrant children.
So let me ask you, Lisa, do you think that there still is a role here for a bilingual education, or do you think the system needs to be changed and modified? We see, obviously, what happened in California. It's been discussed that in New York and other states here, they could soon be following the lead of California. Should it stay as status quo, or should it be changed?
Well, I think one of the things that needs to be changed is, in general, the idea that school districts are mandated to have a specific program. And in many cases with bilingual education in New York, and certainly the way it was before in California, bilingual education was the only way, and so there was only one choice. And I think that's what needs to be changed, where there's mandates. Now, most of the evidence points to the fact that bilingual education doesn't work. And I think certainly what's happened in California, and also the other study that was recently released in New York, supports the idea that students that are taught in English, whether it's English immersion or English as a second language classes that aren't bilingual, tend to be performing better. So I think as a national trend, we tend to see people replicate programs that work, and so moving away from bilingual education will probably happen.
But do you still feel there is a role here for bilingual education, or do you think that it should be strictly an immersion type of educational system?
Well, I don't think that you can mandate and make everyone everywhere have to go to an English-only program at the state level. I mean, I think that there has to be room for some local decision-making, but on the other hand, most bilingual education programs are state mandates, and certainly when you have the initiative process, the people themselves are mandating their choice on what they think works.
Ron, let me bring you back into this. If you asked me a couple of years ago, I probably would have been one of the people who said it's not fair to the kids here to pull the rug out from under them and force them to learn a system. They're going to get turned off by the educational system. They won't really be on the same footing, obviously, as the kids who've spoken English their whole lives here, and they're going to be turned off and probably increase the dropout rates. I've changed my opinion a little bit with these studies, but is it fair to just look at the black and white numbers? Some people say class sizes have been decreased, and there's a lot of factors that go into the performance of these kids in California, and it can't just be labeled that it is all immersion into the classroom.
I'd be the last one to claim that Proposition 227 is the only reason the test scores moved up so rapidly. Now, actually, class size reduction was not a significant factor. In fact, there were studies showing the impact of class size reduction was probably only about 5% or 10% of the improvement in test scores. In other words, it was a fairly negligible factor. The other large factor besides the switch to English immersion was getting rid of whole language and switching over to phonics, because whole language just doesn't work very well and phonics works much better. The ironic thing about it is all the supporters of bilingual education are also supporters of whole language. So they were opposed to both of those changes, and I think they were proven wrong on both grounds. But I really do believe that certainly the increase in test scores was in very significant part caused by eliminating bilingual education. And one sign of it is those school districts in California that tried to keep their bilingual programs showed minimal improvement in test scores. And those that most completely eliminated bilingual education, notably Oceanside down near San Diego, districts like that doubled their test scores in less than 2 years, which is quite remarkable.
Now, let me ask you, one of the byproducts of going to an immersion program here is the reduction in terms of cost that has to go in. You're obviously going to cut down on all of the separate classes that have to go into place here for bilingual education, and in some reports it's a third of the cost if you had bilingual education. Do you suggest here that that money, that savings, be poured back into the schools in terms of additional tutoring here, additional after-school programs, so when the kids find, as they will in all cases in that first 6 months, that roadblock, they're helped and encouraged to stay into it, or do you think the savings should be passed on to the taxpayers?
Well, first of all, there isn't really that large a savings. In other words, different studies have come to different conclusions. But remember, the students in a bilingual classroom are being taught, in a sense, in a similar classroom to a non-bilingual or non-Spanish-oriented classroom. Now, the books are a little bit more expensive, and sometimes they have to pay the teachers a little bit more, but the cost saving is not that gigantic. And in fact, our initiative, Proposition 227, required that the extra money be spent still on those same students, in other words, the immigrant students who don't know English very well, and simply used to improve the program or provide, for example, slightly smaller class size or slightly better materials. But again, the cost savings are not that dramatic. I mean, that is not the best reason to oppose bilingual education, that it costs a huge amount of extra money. The best reason to oppose it is it just doesn't really work compared with English immersion.
One of the, at least to me, one of the most startling numbers that came out in the polls was one of the groups that is the strongest proponent of immersion are the immigrants themselves. In fact, we're putting up a number that came through from the public agenda that 75% of recent immigrants oppose bilingual education here. And I guess the feelings was that they want the next generation to do better, right?
Absolutely. In other words, many immigrant parents know perfectly well that if they knew English a little bit better, if they could read and write English better, they could get a much better job in our society. And they certainly want their children to be taught English as much as possible by the schools. In fact, Proposition 227 originally began when I read a series of articles in Los Angeles Times about a group of immigrant parents in downtown Los Angeles, Latino garment workers, who actually had to start a public boycott of their own local elementary school because it refused to teach their children English. And when a system has reached the point where parents have to carry picket signs because a school refuses to allow their children to learn English, I felt something had to be done about it. All the national polls have shown that the vast, vast majority of immigrant parents oppose native language instruction and want their children taught English as quickly as possible. In fact, one of the parts of 227 that also is very helpful in California is that it takes some of the money saved by eliminating bilingual education and puts it into funding for adult English literacy programs so that, for example, some of the parents of those children can learn English as well. And that way, when the parents and children are both learning English, they can help each other.
Now, obviously, everyone's touting on both sides the success of the program in California. It's been more than rumored, and in fact, you're on record as saying that this should be taken nationwide. Have you, how about New York here specifically? I know you talked about how the city political structure works. It would be pretty difficult for it to pass through New York, right?
Right. Now, actually, I've helped already a group of people in Arizona, parents and teachers and community activists, put a similar initiative on the ballot, which they'll be voting on in just a few weeks, and I think it'll win. I really think it would be tremendously beneficial to try to do something about the failed bilingual programs in New York, and I'm very pessimistic about the state legislature taking any action on this, because the bilingual teachers and the bilingual administrators and the bilingual coordinators and the bilingual academics tend to have a stranglehold on the political process. On the other hand, I do think while it's difficult to put something on the ballot in New York City dealing with this issue, I think it definitely might be worth the effort. And I've already been talking with a few people in New York about possibly working with them to move something like this forward, which I think would be tremendously beneficial.
Lisa, let me ask you before I let you go, do you see any reasons to give you pause here as to move away from the bilingual education in toto, or do you think that there should be at least more of a phasing in period?
No, I think the evidence overwhelmingly points to English immersion as the right way to go. I mean, the problem with programs like bilingual education is that they don't have any kind of accountability for student achievement. And with the English immersion programs in California, you have huge scrutiny where everyone was saying, oh, it's going to fail. And everyone was looking closely at what would happen. And it's amazing because usually when you change something, it takes a couple years for it to get up and going and show positive results. But of course here we've seen dramatic results. And just to put it in perspective, when you have other kinds of reform programs like Title I, which educates remedial education students, if they have 3 percentage point gains with remedial students, which are largely minorities, a lot of the same LEP students, limited English students, they count that as success. So when you're seeing 20 percentage points gains, and I think, again, the evidence has always been here. There's other programs where they have English immersion. So really, I think...
So you have no reason to have any pause. Lisa and Ron, I got to jump to a commercial break, but I want to thank you both for joining me tonight.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
When we come back, we're going to go to your phone calls. Not on lines already, 888-RNN-CHAT. We'll also take a look at some viewer emails as well. Stay with us.